Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our course. I hope the last week went well, that it was rewarding. And this week we're focusing on contemporary nonviolent movements, and we are meant to look also at some of what's happening in the contemporary world. So, as we speak, we're also going to be looking at methods of nonviolent action. But I know that the coursework is also becoming somewhat overwhelming for some, bearing in mind that you have to juggle several things. So the requirement this week is going to be not as demanding perhaps as previous weeks. So we haven't added on any new videos to look at in terms of contemporary struggle. But what I want you to do is reflect on a few things. One is I'd like for you to think about the protests that have been happening in the US and are happening, to think about some of the recent protests in Belarus. And I'm not entirely certain you have access to the kind of media coverage of protests in the recent past in a country like Zimbabwe. Perhaps not. But if you do, it might also be worth looking at. And while you're looking at all of these contemporary protests, I want to frame this a bit for you and for you to think about some of the interconnections that we've been talking about. So, if we think back to the early 1900s and take ourselves to the 1930s, you had the Great Depression in the US, you had unemployment soaring, you had lots of unease in the American context. The kind of catastrophe of unemployment also affected many parts of Europe and many parts of the world that depended on international trade. And we also saw protests emerging in different parts of the world. But politically, what was fascinating for me to think about is we had in the immediate aftermath of the Depression in the 30s, we had the rise of new political spaces. So we had the rise of a political left, but we also know the 30s gave rise to a political right, from Italy to Germany. And now we're going through the COVID pandemic, and we are seeing protests emerge in different parts of the world where people are complaining about lockdown, but people are also complaining about the lack of social welfare from many countries and starting to talk about how they're going to survive the unemployment bloodbath, particularly in the developing South. And perhaps one of the things we need to think about are these protests also opening up spaces for new political activity? If we draw our attention to what's happened in the past, are we going to see the emergence of a new left in the world, in contrast to the authoritarianism from the right in America with Trump, in Brazil with Bolsonaro, with Boris Johnson, perhaps with Duterte, with others in other parts of the world? So that's the one thing I want you to think about and add a layer of complexity to what's happening in terms of protests currently linked to COVID and historically linked to the depression and unemployment that had resulted from that. The other timeline I want to draw is a more recent one, and to draw your attention to 2008, right? The economic crisis that the world faced and the protests that emerged after that. And many would like to suggest that what occurred in 2008 was to capitalism what 89 was to socialism, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But just to maybe draw your attention to this timeline, 2008, the economic crisis of the world, 2009 and 10, the Arab Spring that emerged, in many ways coming out of that economic crisis, unemployment and desperation was heightened. The young man Mohamed Bouazizi sparks the protest on the streets of Tunis, and in 2010 that spreads to Egypt, to Morocco, to Libya, and to other parts of the Middle East and North America. You then have young people in the US inspired by that, influenced by that, and you have, in many ways, the American offshoot of the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement in 2011. And then later on, of course, intensified in 2013 with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement. So we are living in an interesting space politically, that there are a number of protest movements emerging in the context of our socio-political realities. So I just thought that context might be important for you to think about as you think about what's happening in the contemporary world, right? And with unemployment and with desperation growing amongst young people in the developing South, there's a likelihood that protests are likely to emerge as the full impact of COVID-19 is felt. And perhaps one of the other questions you can think about, and we as intellectuals need to think about, is there a possibility of unrest that could result in a new African spring, or a spring in the or a kind of unrest that resembles the Arab Spring in the developing South as a result of what's happening with COVID? So think about that, and think about a number of other protests that are happening. And one of the questions you have to think about in your assignment this week is, what strikes you as new and innovative about what the demonstrators have been doing in current protests? And you also have your 2 to 3 paragraphs to write about, like you have been doing. So I think that's one important thing to do. And then, of course, your material in online, the USEP material, the Chapter 4 material is your focus this week, looking at methods of nonviolent actions, looking at what Gene Sharp documented many years ago in 1973, the 200 nonviolent methods, or almost 200, the politics of nonviolent action. That's a much talked about method of nonviolent action, and that's worth looking at. The material also talks about the 3 categories of protest, 3 categories of nonviolent action, one being protest and persuasion, the other being non-cooperation, and the other being intervention. And each of that is unpacked in the material and worth looking at. Then the ideas of acts of omission and commission in the context of nonviolent action, the ideas around constructive and obstructive engagement. Those might be 2 other areas in the relatively brief material for this week. There are some fascinating materials on developing campaign, on how to build political education, how to focus on consciousness raising. And if we think about, well, they were not necessarily non-violent, but if you think about movements in recent history, the Black Panther movement in the US, its focus on political education and consciousness building, and its offshoot in the global South, the Black Consciousness movement of Stephen Bantu Biko, which also focused on political education and consciousness building. So those are areas perhaps worth looking at. And then the goals in the context of campaigns, internal goals, external goals, networking goals, and how important this idea of social capital is in protest. I would ask you to spend a little time when thinking about the role of external actors. That, as you know, has been controversial for a long, long time, and more so in the recent past. But we know that when it comes to nonviolent movements are less reliant on outside support. Now let's make the comparison. I made the point that non-violent movements are generally less reliant on outside support. So how do we juxtapose that? We can think about movements that relied on violent resistance, right? From Algeria in the 60s to many parts of Asia, to Latin America, and to many of the liberation movements and their armed wings in Southern Africa. And apologies again for constantly referencing Southern Africa, because that in many ways is my area of focus. So how did violent movements, well, I wouldn't necessarily call them violent movements, but how did the armed wings of liberation movements that also used violence as a cause of action? Let's take a few examples. You had an armed wing of the Mandela movement in South Africa. The African National Congress had an armed wing called Umkhonto weSizwe, meaning the spear of the nation. Had outside help, supported by the USSR, right? Then if you take other movements in Southern Africa, Frelimo in Mozambique, supported by the Chinese in the early years. Zimbabwe with Robert Mugabe, supported by the Soviet Union and the Chinese, right? So a lot of these movements had support from the outside world. And the point the literature is making is that non-violent movements are generally less reliant on outside help. The other thing you may want to think about is the politics of NGOs and funding, the politics of civil society funding, which is a completely different kettle of fish, but impacts here in terms of how civil society and the funding modalities of civil society impact on how resistance movements have to act. And then the last part I want you to look at is the area around managing violence and repression, where the material talks about the paradox of repression. There are some interesting points there about overt action, action that's less lethal, and it looks at action from assassinations to actions of diversion and manipulation. I think the content this week might be less demanding than previous weeks, but I would say arguably more interesting. So I would encourage you to read the material, but to also think about the material in the context of the timeline that I presented and in the context of some of the protests that we are seeing around the world. I'll look at some of the comments you are making online and in the discussion forum, and some of the interviews you've had, and comment on some of them. And again, I'm open to emails and open to responding to any concerns you might have. I do know on another note that Bruce may have been in touch, and or you might receive an email shortly or in the coming days about the trip to South Africa in 2021. I think that's on the cards, and I'm happy to talk more about that in our synchronous session. Let's aim for that synchronous session perhaps next week, and I'll send more details about that. Thank you so much for your time, and all the best with the coming week.